Hello and welcome. My name is Father William Maestri, and this is Overfed and Undernourished. If I began this particular video by saying, we'd like to review some quotes and some important words from an important political and philosophical commentator by the name of Eric Blair, immediately we would probably, many of us would say, well, who is Eric Blair, by the way? Well, we know Eric Blair more famously by the name George Orwell. That became his pseudonym. And he borrowed the name Orwell from a river, the River Orwell, that was near where he grew up in Suffolk, in England. And he used to go there and walk around and meditate and commune with nature. He was very appreciative of the beauty and the serenity that went with nature. And so he adopted the name Orwell and became George Orwell, known to many, many people, of course, for his 1984 Animal Farm, his essays, especially Why Do I Write, and various other novels that he wrote about his experiences. I would really suggest reading a biography of George Orwell. He lived a fascinating life. His seminal experience was he decided to participate in the Spanish Civil War back in the 1930s. And he fought on the side of those who were attempting to overthrow the fascists under General Franco in Spain. And the seminal event in his life, which colored everything he did going forward, his troops, the forces he was fighting with against the fascists, they were engaged in a battle, and Orwell should have been mortally wounded and dead. There should never have been a George Orwell, frankly. He was shot right through the throat with a high-powered rifle from the enemy. But he managed to recover. And as he went along after the Franco forces in Spain eventually defeated the insurrectionists, he became disillusioned with a kind of Marxist communism, as did many young people and intellectuals in the 1930s and 40s even. And he began to see the flaws and the deficiencies there, and began to turn his attention to writing. Another significant event, but nowhere near his near-fatal death in Spain, he followed his father for a while, for a number of years as a matter of fact, as a royal official in the British police, in this case in Burma, in India, and around that part of the world. And he really grew to despise that particular job. And he came back after resigning his position and decided to take up writing. And that led to the George Orwell that we know, not simply a figure from the 30s, 40s. He died in 1950. He was born in 1903. And his influence has only grown over the past decades, and certainly today there is what can rightfully be called a real revival, a reappreciation of the insights and commentary of George Orwell. And so by way of introducing you to Orwell, which I thought would be a kind of quotable Orwell on three important topics. And the reason I chose these, one of Orwell's quotes, which I think is very, very profound in its own way. He said, "To see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle." The most obvious that's in front of us is the thing that we often overlook. And there's three areas that I would like to share the thoughts of Orwell with that I think are very germane for today. The importance of history, the question of power, and the crucial importance of the ability to think for oneself, the ability of freedom, free speech and free thought. And this is something that was precious to Orwell, because for Orwell, the most significant reality on the face of the earth is that of the individual. The individual's ability to think and to speak for himself or herself. And all of the modern forces, ideologically, structurally, politically, that were coming into play to reduce the significance of the individual. And this, Orwell thought, was one of the great tragedies of modernity, to once again affirm the ultimate importance of the individual. So the first area, I thought, because it is germane today, because there is so much debate and rejection of history, the monuments issue or controversy is but a symptom of a deeper growing lack of appreciation for history. This kind of need to rewrite history, to revise history, and in some instances to simply deny and distort history. We see that again and again and again, especially as many of those whom we had honored, even Frederick Douglass, his statue was defaced by so-called individuals who are interested in social justice and racial equality and so on and so forth. Frederick Douglass is one of the great pioneers in American history, and yet he suffered the same fate as our so-called disgraced Confederate generals. This is what Orwell wrote. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And that's really a very profound statement. Who controls the past controls the future. If you don't know your past, then you don't know where you're going. You don't learn from it what worked, and you don't learn what to avoid. And so this washing of history, this rewriting of history that we see going on in much of the popular culture, as well as in academia, as well as through the media, and even in the government itself. This is a very dangerous game, because it cuts us off from a future and leaves us stuck in a present, or a past that is only evil, oppressive, and bad. It fails to see what is good and what we can learn from the past. And if you control the present, you also learn to control the past. And it's really a fight today for the culture of the present by eliminating the past. And Orwell would have been greatly disturbed by this, because he believed in the importance of history to teach us what to do and what not to do. In addition to the importance of the past, has simply a collective memory. He also believed that it was a great tool for teaching. He wrote the following. He said, "A generation of the unteachable is hanging upon us like a necklace of corpses." In other words, if we don't know our past, the present is dead. We don't understand really who we are. We may walk, and we are the walking dead. It's to be cut off from your memory. And so we are like dead weight in the present, because we're either going to repeat the failures of the past, a la Santayana, the great Spanish-American philosopher, or we're going to go blindly into the future. And we can't afford a generation of the walking dead, corpses around our neck as a kind of dead weight and necklace. In terms of power, Orwell wrote, "In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues." And the reason for that is the tremendous need, the tremendous desire for power. Politics is power. It's the ability to control, to influence, to get things done. And we see that so much of the polarization and the division, a recent study that was done has indicated that in the last 50 years, the United States government, the Congress, has never been more polarized, as well as the citizenry in general, on the leading issues of the day, from popular culture to the great issues that come before the Congress, come before the government. And this polarization is really about power. It's really about control. Every issue becomes political. In the midst of the coronavirus, you have a hearing before the Congress on medical approaches, on public health. You see what happens if you look at C-SPAN and watch the various hearings. Everyone is trying to score political points. Everything becomes political today. There is no issue that does not escape the great Leviathan, as Thomas Hobbes called it, the great Leviathan, that great monster that seeks to subsume everything into the realm of politics, which means everything is about power, and often it comes down to almost life and death. That's the intensity of the struggle that we see today. And it follows, as Orwell goes on to say, we know that no one ever seizes power with the intention of relinquishing it. There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program. Individuals become entrenched in the power of the political. And that's why from the beginning of this country, that was a great fear, that there would be entrenched power. We see that in Washington today. Lobbyists, various interest groups. We see various political groups forming together to make sure that their particular ideologies and programs continue on and on. You may change the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, but it's still the Titanic. And so you can change the players in Congress, but it seems that the same business as usual takes place. People often today, and for a number of past generations, once they get that taste of power, it transforms the person. They come in with good intentions. They come in with the idea of the common good, of working for the citizen, a servant of the people. And yet that atmosphere of power, it makes one, it changes one. It changes the very structure of the person in terms of their thinking, their priorities, and in terms of their actions. And a final point on power that I thought was interesting, that Orwell said, power is tearing minds to pieces and putting them together again in new shapes of your own choosing. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what we see going on is really a battle for the minds and hearts of our culture, of the American people. It's an intellectual power, because the idea is the father of the deed. And ideas that are preached perhaps and taught in high levels of society and culture, they filter down into the popular levels. And they filter out into our schools. They filter out into our daily conversations, in the way in which we think and speak, which eventually affects the way we act. And so it becomes entrenched, again, in the mind, these ideas. And as Victor Hugo said, there is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come. And so it's not simply bodies. It's not simply actions per se. These actions have their genesis in the mind, in ideas that become part of the everyday furniture in which we live. And we see that more and more today. And what happens is that those in power, they begin to change our perception, our way of thinking, which is ultimately our action, which influences the shape of our society and of our culture. It is really, it's a battle for the heart and soul of the American experience at this particular moment. And the final little area, which is really not little, very significant area, is that of freedom. Freedom to think one's thoughts, and also the ability to express those, to speak, not to be shouted down, not to be silenced. But the life breath of a democracy is the free exchange of ideas and of thoughts. And to, at the end of the day, perhaps, to disagree with one another without being disagreeable. Certainly not violent, certainly not destructive. And we really don't get anywhere in a democracy, especially, by silencing those with whom we disagree. Those are the ones whom we most must give that breath, that oxygen of democracy to, the ones that we most disagree with. They're important in any living democracy. And Orwell said this: freedom is the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And we see that today, to tell people what they do not want to hear. And in some of our colleges and university campuses, we witness demonstrations, the obstruction of voices that we don't want to hear. And we are the losers as a society for that. We missed those blind spots that we all have. It's like driving an automobile. You always have to watch out for the blind spots. It's not simply, again, what you see through the windshield. It's also on the side of you. And there's a strong movement today that there are certain things that you can talk about, certain things you can't, certain expressions you can use, certain expressions you can't. You have to follow a very important language code that is enforced by the thought police, by newspeak. And there are certain things that can get you ostracized, fired, banished from any kind of exposure if you happen not to use the right vocabulary, the right ideology, or the consensus of the view that controls the information that we receive today. Our minds get shaped that way. And so we lose a great deal again when we don't have the freedom to express the unpopular, that which is out of favor with the conventional wisdom. And especially for a nation that has cherished those who are out of the mainstream, and how often civilization has advanced by listening to those in the beginning who were considered odd, strange, dangerous, eccentric. Tremendous advances have been made by listening to those particular voices. And he said this, which I think is important: everyone believes in the atrocities of the enemy and disbelieves in those of his own side without ever bothering to examine the evidence. In other words, we get locked in our ideology, and we are pure and the other side is purely evil. It is very difficult to have any kind of conversation or dialogue if we start off with those premises. Why would I ever want to talk to somebody whom I believe is inherently evil, who is inherently bad? We have an ideology that's gaining traction today, that white people are genetically racist. There's something actually in the DNA. It's a genetic component. Well, we're not responsible for that. No one is responsible for their genetic makeup. No one is responsible for that. And so it's something that they're born with. So if it's something they're born with, how do they get over it? How do we actually move from the barricades and the ideological battlefields to the common ground? of what unites us rather than what divides us, and will forever divide us. That's impossible. And so we look at the atrocities of the other side and say, well, what do you expect? That's the way those people are. And my side, oh my goodness, white robes, and I have garland wreaths, and I am pure. All of us fall short of the glory of God. All of us have flaws and have difficulties and things we're not proud of. Ideologies and movements that once attracted us that perhaps today we've outgrown. We see their flaws and we've moved on. But that's not allowed today because you're either with me or against me. And that's really poisonous to a democracy. He also said something important. He said it was an act of self-hypnosis, a deliberate drowning of consciousness by means of rhythmic noise. He was talking about his experiences within the Communist Party. It was the noise, the shout of the crowd, the mob, the voices that speak the loudest. And often the voice that speaks the loudest is often the voice that carries the moment, but really doesn't carry us forward. We say that the wheel that squeaks the loudest gets the oil, but it's also the first one replaced. And we haven't learned that perhaps it's more important to speak softly and speak longer than to speak loudly for a short period of time. And that's something that's very important, and we can't be hypnotized by the volume, because volume is not proportional to the worthiness of the content of what is being said. And finally, he said that within important issues, there are always aspects no one wishes to discuss. What is the elephant in the room? What are those issues that we are really not willing to look at? And there are many. The composition of the family today, the impact of the breakdown of the family within those of various challenges economically and socially in our urban centers, in our rural centers, the great debate about the life issues. These are issues that often have drawn us far apart because if we even discuss them, immediately we're on two different planets. And I think that, what he's saying there is, what are those issues that are worthy of discussion, but they can't be discussed? Those are the most important issues. When you go to a meeting, for example, and at the meeting there, everyone says, oh, it was a wonderful meeting. It was great. It was terrific. Everybody was in agreement. You can bet that the most important issues were never discussed. The old World War II pilots used to have an expression, the flak is the strongest the closer you get over the target. And when you get over a target, you're going to have flak. You're going to have disagreement. You're going to have opposition. But it means you're over something important. And what a shame it would be if we stopped talking to one another rather than at one another, about one another, or past one another. And so this is some of the flavor of George Orwell's thinking. And I think that almost 75 years later, it really is a distant mirror. It's a mirror that holds up to ourselves many of the issues and conflicts that he went through in his own life and in his own time, and really speak to us today in our own challenging time. Orwell was a man of great experience, great wisdom and insight that is offered to us. The question to us is, are we humble enough and wise enough to learn the lessons?